Everyone was waiting for chaos. That's what made this moment so dangerous. Fans expected headlines. Players expected panic. Social media expected a standoff that would force someone to blink. And for a brief moment, it felt like the entire future of the league was hanging on one unanswered question. What happens when the deadline passes and nothing explodes? No lockout, no shutdown, no dramatic collapse. Instead, the league just kept moving. Behind closed doors, something very different was unfolding. Not a crisis, not confusion, not desperation, but confidence. Quiet, calculated confidence that didn't need a press conference to make its point. While public statements flew back and forth, while people argued about fairness and value and respect, the actual business of basketball never slowed down. And that's the part most people missed. Because when you strip away the noise, when you stop listening to who's talking the loudest and start watching who's actually acting, a much clearer picture emerges. This wasn't a stalemate. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power test, and one side didn't even feel the need to raise its voice. The real story here isn't about a deadline. It's about leverage, and more importantly, who never actually had it. While fans were focused on names and faces, while headlines teased walkouts and dramatic exits, the league was already proving something uncomfortable. That it could function just fine without agreement. That it didn't need permission to move forward. And that the people who thought they were holding the cards may have misunderstood the game entirely. And once you see how this unfolded, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because the moment the deadline passed wasn't the end of negotiations. It was the beginning of a reality check. And it all started with a date that was supposed to change everything, but didn't. January came and went with more anticipation than certainty. For weeks, the build-up felt dramatic. Public statements stacked on top of each other. Social media buzzed with predictions. Commentators framed the moment as a breaking point, the kind of deadline that forces action because there's no other choice left. That's how it was supposed to work. When a collective bargaining agreement expires, people expect disruption. They expect pressure. They expect the league to feel cornered, especially when negotiations stretch past the line in the sand everyone agreed mattered most. But when that line was crossed, something unexpected happened. Nothing stopped. No emergency announcements. No frantic scrambling. No last-second concessions made out of fear. The clock hit midnight, and the league didn't flinch. Instead of freezing operations, instead of hitting pause and waiting for resolution, the system simply rolled forward. Quietly. Smoothly. Almost casually. And that alone told you more than any press release ever could. Because deadlines only matter if the consequences are real. And in this case, the consequences everyone expected never arrived. The assumption was simple. Without a new agreement in place, the league couldn't operate. That free agency would stall. That expansion plans would hang in limbo. That uncertainty would force ownership to come back to the table desperate to close the deal. But that assumption was wrong. Legally, the league was protected. Structurally, it was prepared. And strategically, it was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The so-called deadline wasn't a cliff. It was just another marker on a calendar the league never intended to treat as final. This is where the gap between perception and reality became impossible to ignore. From the outside, it looked like a standoff. 2 sides locked in a battle, waiting to see who would cave first. But on the inside, one side had already accepted that the deal wouldn't be finished in time, and built a plan that didn't require it to be. That's what made this moment so revealing. The league wasn't scrambling because it didn't need to. It wasn't rushing because it wasn't under threat. And it wasn't negotiating from a position of fear, no matter how loudly that fear was projected by others. What most people didn't realize is that under U.S. labor law, an expired agreement doesn't automatically mean paralysis. It triggers a status quo period, a legal framework that allows operations to continue under the existing terms while negotiations carry on. And the league knew exactly how to use that window. The difference wasn't legal knowledge. Both sides had access to the same rules. The difference was expectation. One side believed the absence of a new deal would halt everything. The other side understood it as an opportunity to keep moving while the clock worked in their favor. That's why the moment felt so strange to anyone watching closely. Because while public narratives framed the situation as unresolved, internally, decisions were already being made. Timelines were being set. Plans were being finalized. And the league's machinery never stopped turning. Free agency didn't vanish. Expansion didn't pause. Preparation didn't slow. And every day that passed without disruption quietly shifted the balance of power. Players still needed contracts. Teams still needed rosters. And seasons don't wait for ideal circumstances. That's the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. Basketball doesn't stop because negotiations get tense. And once that reality sinks in, leverage starts to look very different. Because leverage isn't about who's right. It's about who can afford to wait. And from the way this deadline came and went, it became clear that only one side truly could. But the deadline itself wasn't the most important moment. The real turning point happened quietly, away from cameras and commentary, when a single message went out that changed the tone of everything that followed. And that message didn't come with a press conference. The most important moment in this entire situation didn't happen in public. There was no announcement blasted across social media. No breaking news banner. No carefully worded quote designed to calm fans or send a message to critics. In fact, most people didn't even realize it happened at all until the effects started showing up days later. But behind the scenes, the league made a move that instantly reframed the entire power dynamic. It was a call. Actually, it was a series of calls. Direct, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand. The league reached out to every general manager and delivered the same message, over and over again, without hesitation or ambiguity. Proceed as usual. That was it. No panic. No qualifiers. No wait and see. Just a clear directive that cut straight through weeks of uncertainty. Free agency planning wasn't on hold. Outreach wasn't delayed. Offers weren't discouraged. Teams were told to prepare, to engage, and to move forward exactly as if negotiations weren't still unresolved. That one instruction changed everything. Because until that moment, many assumed the league was still waiting. That ownership would hesitate, worried about backlash or legal complications. That teams would be cautious, afraid to step into uncertain territory without a finalized agreement protecting every move. Instead, the league flipped the script. By telling teams to keep going, ownership did something subtle but powerful. They signaled confidence, not just in their legal footing, but in their ability to control the pace of events. And once pace shifts, leverage usually follows. Think about what that message really meant. It wasn't just about logistics. It wasn't just about paperwork or timelines. It was a psychological move as much as a procedural one. The league was telling teams, and indirectly players, that basketball doesn't stop for negotiations. That planning doesn't pause for statements. And that waiting was no longer part of the equation. For the players' union, this wasn't the response they expected. The assumption had been that ownership would slow things down. That without a deal, uncertainty would paralyze decision-making. That pressure would build as deadlines stacked up, forcing concessions simply to restore order. But instead of freezing, the league accelerated. Teams began mapping out rosters, identifying targets, lining up priorities. Conversations started happening quietly, long before anything could be signed. And those conversations mattered, because once players know where interest lies, momentum starts to form. And momentum is hard to reverse. This is where the power imbalance became impossible to ignore. While public-facing messaging from the union focused on principles, fairness, and long-term value, ownership was already dealing in practical realities. Who fits where? Who wants what? Who's ready to move now? By the time anyone realized what was happening, the framework of free agency was already being built, without waiting for approval. And that's what made the call so effective. It didn't challenge the union directly. It didn't escalate tensions. It simply bypassed the expectation that negotiations had to come first. And once teams began operating under that assumption, the union's leverage quietly eroded. Because leverage depends on disruption. If operations continue smoothly, if teams adapt quickly, if players still receive interest and opportunities, then the urgency to compromise shifts dramatically. The pressure doesn't disappear, it just changes sides. Players started hearing from teams. Agents started gauging interest. Front offices began shaping narratives about future plans. And none of it required a signed agreement to start. That reality landed hard. Suddenly, the idea that ownership needed a deal to function didn't hold up anymore. The league wasn't acting like it was stuck. It was acting like it was in control. And control is contagious. Once teams saw that the league wasn't backing down, hesitation vanished. Nobody wanted to be the last organization waiting while others prepared. Nobody wanted to fall behind because they assumed things would stall. So they moved, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. This is the part fans rarely see. The part that doesn't trend. The part that doesn't generate outrage, but determines outcomes all the same. Because while public narratives are shaped by statements, real decisions are shaped by action. And the league's action sent a message that didn't need translation. We're not entertaining delays. We're not waiting to be pressured. And we're not handing control of the calendar to anyone else. For the union, this was a wake-up call. Negotiations didn't stop, but the context shifted. Instead of bargaining against a stalled system, they were now negotiating alongside a league that had already chosen to move forward. And that changes the math entirely. Because once business continues, every day without a deal becomes more costly for the side that needs urgency to win. Teams didn't need signatures yet. Players didn't need contracts yet. But the direction was set. And once direction is set, reversing course becomes nearly impossible. The most telling part is how little noise this created at first. No outrage. No backlash. Just quiet compliance. Which is often how the most decisive moments unfold. By the time anyone realized that ownership had seized control of the timeline, the process was already in motion. Conversations were happening. Expectations were forming. And the leverage the union believed it held began slipping away, one call at a time. But the real shock wasn't just that the league moved forward. It was that legally they were fully allowed to. And that realization opened the door to a much bigger problem the union hadn't fully accounted for. A problem buried in the fine print of labor law that would soon work almost entirely against them. And that's where this situation became far more dangerous than anyone expected. On the surface, the phrase sounds harmless. Status quo. It feels neutral, balanced, almost fair. A temporary holding pattern where nothing changes until everyone agrees. That's how most people understand it. And that misunderstanding is exactly why this moment became such a trap. Because in professional sports labor negotiations, status quo doesn't mean stillness. It means survival under old rules. And the side that can live with those old rules the longest usually wins. Under U.S. labor law, when a collective bargaining agreement expires without a replacement, the league isn't required to shut down. Instead, it's obligated to maintain the existing conditions while negotiations continue. Salaries, contract structures, free agency mechanisms, they all stay in place until a new deal is ratified. That sounds reasonable, even protective. But here's what most people miss. Status quo doesn't freeze ambition. It doesn't freeze planning. And it definitely doesn't freeze leverage. It simply locks the financial framework in time. For ownership, that's a manageable inconvenience. For players, especially those without guaranteed long-term security, it's a slow-burning problem. Because while the rules remain the same, life doesn't. Careers don't. And earning windows don't. This is where the union's strategy began to unravel. The expectation was that status quo would create pressure. That operating under outdated terms would frustrate ownership enough to force compromise. That the league would feel compelled to resolve negotiations quickly to unlock new revenue models and growth strategies. But that pressure never materialized. Why? Because the league already knew how to operate under these terms. It had done so for years, decades even. The financial limitations were familiar, predictable, and most importantly, survivable. For ownership, status quo wasn't a crisis, it was a known environment. For players, especially those nearing free agency or relying on new contracts to stabilize their futures, it was something else entirely. Time stopped working in their favor. Every day without a new agreement meant another day operating under salary structures that no longer reflected the league's growth. Another day where raises remained theoretical. Another day where potential gains stayed locked behind negotiations that could drag on indefinitely. And the league understood this dynamic perfectly. That's why they didn't panic. That's why they didn't rush. And that's why they were comfortable letting the clock keep ticking. Because time itself had become leverage. The union believed it could weaponize uncertainty. That fear of disruption would force ownership to act. But uncertainty cuts both ways. And once it became clear that the league could function normally without a deal, the emotional weight of that uncertainty shifted entirely onto the players. Teams still needed to plan. Rosters still needed to be built. Careers still needed direction. And those decisions couldn't wait forever. This is where the trap closed. Status quo meant free agency mechanisms stayed active. Core designations still applied. Qualifying offers still had deadlines. Expansion drafts still loomed. And all of those processes carried real consequences for players, regardless of whether a new deal existed. Ownership didn't need to threaten anyone. The system did it for them. Players who waited too long risked losing opportunities. Teams that delayed conversations risked falling behind. And agents suddenly found themselves navigating a market that was moving forward under rules everyone claimed were outdated, but still legally binding. That contradiction created pressure in all the wrong places. Publicly, the union talked about fairness and future sustainability. Privately, individual players were doing the math, calculating risks, weighing principles against paychecks. And that's where collective resolve starts to crack. Because status quo doesn't reward unity. It rewards patience. And patience is easier when you're not the one facing immediate consequences. The league could wait. Teams could adapt. But players had finite careers. That imbalance turned status quo into a silent advantage for ownership. Every passing week without disruption reinforced the idea that the league didn't need to change anything urgently. That negotiations could stretch. That public pressure could be absorbed. And that the system would keep functioning as designed. The union's leverage depended on the league feeling discomfort. But the discomfort never reached the people they needed it to. Instead, it settled on the players themselves. The irony is that status quo was meant to protect both sides. In practice, it protected the side with the most resources, the longest timelines, and the least personal risk. And ownership knew exactly how to use it. They didn't escalate. They didn't antagonize. They simply waited. And as they waited, the framework they controlled continued to shape outcomes. This is why the status quo period became such a dangerous place for the union. Not because it stripped them of rights, but because it exposed a harsh reality they couldn't negotiate away. Leverage isn't about who has the better argument. It's about who can endure the waiting game. And once it became clear that ownership could endure far longer than the players, the entire negotiation shifted. But even that wasn't the most damaging realization. Because as the weeks passed, another problem surfaced. One the union couldn't fix with messaging or solidarity. They weren't just negotiating against ownership anymore. They were negotiating against themselves. And that internal fracture would soon become impossible to hide. From the outside, unity looked strong. Statements were aligned. Messaging was coordinated. The language used by leadership emphasized togetherness, shared goals, and collective progress. To anyone watching casually, it felt like a solid front, players standing shoulder to shoulder, prepared to wait as long as necessary to secure what they believed they deserved. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Something far less stable. Because the union wasn't negotiating as a single group with a single set of priorities. It was negotiating as dozens of individual careers stacked on top of each other, all moving at different speeds, all facing different realities. And those realities didn't line up. At the top were the stars. Players with endorsement deals. Players with visibility. Players whose names carried weight beyond the league itself. For them, time was uncomfortable but survivable. A delayed contract didn't mean immediate financial stress. Holding out for long-term structural changes made sense, especially if those changes could redefine earning potential for years to come. But below them were the majority. Veterans without long-term guarantees. Role players fighting for roster spots. Younger players still trying to establish themselves. For this group, the negotiation wasn't theoretical. It wasn't about future models or abstract percentages. It was about stability, security, and whether their next contract would cover rent, training, and the short window they had left to earn. And that gap created tension the union couldn't publicly acknowledge. Because what helps one group doesn't always help the other. Revenue sharing sounds powerful in theory. A percentage-based model tied to growth feels fair, even inspiring. But in practice, the biggest gains go to those already positioned to benefit the most. The players with the highest market value. The players with the most leverage individually. Meanwhile, players closer to the margins needed something simpler. Higher floors. Guaranteed raises. Immediate money. They weren't thinking about what the league might earn in 5 years. They were thinking about what they needed this season. And that difference in perspective quietly pulled the union apart. Leadership had to speak in universal terms. It had to sell the idea that everyone's interests were aligned. But behind closed doors, agents were fielding very different questions from very different players. How long can this last? What happens if nothing changes? What if teams start moving on without me? Those questions don't disappear just because messaging stays consistent. They grow. And as the status quo period stretched on, the internal strain became harder to manage. Players who initially supported a hardline stance began reconsidering. Not because they disagreed with the goal, but because the cost of waiting started to feel personal. This is the hidden vulnerability of any labor movement. Solidarity is strongest when sacrifices are equal. When they're not, cracks form. Stars could afford patience. Others couldn't, and ownership understood that distinction better than anyone. They didn't need to divide the union themselves. They simply needed to let time do it for them. Every day without a deal amplified the difference between players who could wait and those who couldn't. And eventually, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. You start hearing quieter conversations, agents testing the waters, players asking hypothetical questions that aren't so hypothetical anymore. What if I sign now? What if I take the offer? What if I can't afford to wait? Those thoughts don't make someone disloyal. They make them human. But once enough individuals start thinking that way, collective resolve weakens. This is why the league didn't need to apply pressure publicly. It didn't need to threaten lockouts or issue ultimatums. It simply maintained the system and let individual incentives do the rest. Because when negotiations drag on, unity becomes fragile. And the union faced another problem it couldn't easily solve. Even if leadership wanted to prioritize immediate salary increases to satisfy the majority, doing so risked alienating the stars pushing for long-term structural change. But leaning too hard into future-focused demands risked losing the support of players who needed tangible improvements now. There was no perfect middle ground. Every decision favored someone and frustrated someone else. And while those debates played out internally, the league stayed silent, letting the contrast speak for itself. Ownership didn't have to explain its position when the union was struggling to maintain alignment within its own ranks. That's when the situation became truly unstable. Because once players start thinking as individuals instead of a collective, negotiations shift from ideological to transactional. And transactional decisions are far easier to manage. The union wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But it was stretched thin. And ownership knew that eventually someone would blink. Not because they lost faith in the cause, but because the system made waiting too expensive. That realization set the stage for the next turning point. Because while public narratives framed ownership as stubborn or resistant, something critical was being ignored. The league had already put real money on the table. Money that changed the entire conversation. And once those numbers entered the picture, the divide inside the union became impossible to hide. For weeks, the conversation sounded the same. Players weren't being valued. Ownership wasn't negotiating in good faith. The league wasn't sharing the rewards of its growth. That framing spread fast because it fit an easy story. A growing league, rising visibility, bigger crowds, more attention. And yet, players insisting they were still being left behind. On the surface, it made sense, until the actual numbers surfaced. And when they did, they changed everything. Quietly at first, then all at once. Behind closed doors, ownership had already outlined a financial structure that looked nothing like the narrative being pushed publicly. Not incremental increases, not symbolic raises, but a complete overhaul of what earning in the league could look like. The proposed maximum contracts jumped to levels the league had never seen. Mid-tier salaries more than doubled. Rookie deals leapt into territory that would have sounded impossible just a few seasons earlier. This wasn't a token gesture. It was a fundamental reset. And that's where the messaging began to crack. Because once those figures were understood, the argument that ownership wasn't willing to invest became much harder to defend. These weren't promises tied to future revenue. They weren't conditional on hypothetical growth. They were concrete offers, immediate, guaranteed, and life-changing for the majority of players. For someone who had been making a fraction of that amount, the difference wasn't philosophical. It was transformative. And ownership knew exactly what they were doing by framing the conversation this way. They weren't saying, "We won't pay you more." They were saying, "We already are." The emphasis shifted from percentages to paychecks, from ideals to impact. And that shift resonated differently depending on where a player stood in the league hierarchy. For stars, the numbers were impressive but incomplete. They saw opportunity for even greater upside in a revenue-sharing model tied to long-term growth. For them, maximizing the ceiling mattered. But for everyone else, the floor mattered more. Doubling salaries. raising minimums, creating stability that didn't depend on projections or future deals. That was real, and it created an uncomfortable tension inside the union. Because how do you argue against money that changes lives? Publicly, leadership had to maintain the stance that the fight was about fairness and value. But privately, players were comparing numbers, talking to agents, realizing that what was being offered now was more than they had ever expected to see in their careers. That's when the narrative stopped being clean. Ownership wasn't just offering growth. They were offering security. And in a league where careers can be short and opportunities limited, security is powerful. This is where the argument about revenue sharing began to lose traction with certain segments of the player base. Revenue sharing is abstract. Salary increases are tangible. One depends on future success. The other hits your bank account now. And ownership leaned into that distinction. They framed their position carefully. Not as resistance, but as responsibility. As a commitment to building a sustainable system that paid players more without overextending a league that still relied on external support. Whether people liked that framing or not, it landed. Because the numbers backed it up. This wasn't a league claiming poverty while pocketing profits. It was a league still finding its financial footing, offering unprecedented raises while asking for patience on structural changes that required profitability first. That context mattered. It exposed a disconnect between public perception and financial reality. Growth didn't mean profitability. Visibility didn't mean surplus. And ownership was betting that once players understood that difference, the pressure would shift. And it did. Suddenly, the question wasn't, why won't they pay us? It became, how long can we afford to wait? For players on the bubble, that question answered itself. Turning down a dramatically higher offer in hopes of a better deal later requires confidence that later will come, and that you'll still be part of it. Not everyone had that luxury. And ownership didn't need to say any of this out loud. They let the numbers do the talking. They let agents explain the math. They let players discuss it privately. They let reality settle in. And once it did, the union faced a brutal dilemma. Hold the line for a principle that promised future upside, or accept a deal that immediately reshaped earnings across the board. Neither choice was easy, but one was far more tempting for a majority of players. That's why this moment was so destabilizing. Because the fight stopped being about whether ownership was being fair. It became about whether waiting was worth it. And that calculation didn't favor unity. As the money on the table grew harder to ignore, the pressure inside the union intensified. Conversations shifted. Expectations changed. And the idea of holding out indefinitely began to feel less heroic and more risky. That's when ownership's strategy became clear. They weren't trying to win a public debate. They were winning a private one. And the next phase of this standoff would prove just how effective that approach really was, especially once the focus shifted from money on paper to revenue that didn't yet exist. On paper, it sounds perfect. Revenue sharing, a percentage of the league's success. Players finally receiving a cut that reflects their value. It's the kind of concept that wins arguments instantly. Fair, modern, progressive. In other leagues, it's the gold standard. So when the players' union pushed for it, the demand felt not just reasonable, but overdue. But here's the part almost nobody wanted to say out loud. Revenue sharing only works when there's revenue to share. And that's where the entire conversation quietly derailed. The league's growth has been real. Ratings up, attendance up, sponsorships improving, visibility higher than ever. Those facts aren't in dispute. But growth and profitability are not the same thing, and confusing the two can be disastrous in negotiations. Behind the scenes, ownership wasn't arguing against the idea of sharing success. They were arguing against sharing projections. Because what the league had wasn't surplus. It was investment, subsidies, long-term bets still being funded by outside support. The financial engine wasn't producing excess cash. It was still being fueled to stay running. That distinction mattered more than any headline. Revenue sharing assumes a stable, self-sustaining operation. It assumes money flowing in at a level that can be split without jeopardizing the system itself. And despite the optimism, the league wasn't there yet. Ownership knew this. The union knew it too, even if it wasn't said publicly. That's why the two sides kept talking past each other. The union framed revenue sharing as recognition. Ownership saw it as risk. And neither side was technically wrong. They were just operating from different definitions of success. For players, The logic was emotional as much as financial. Without them, there is no league. Without their performances, there are no fans, no deals, no growth. So why shouldn't they share directly in the upside? It's a powerful argument. But ownership's counter was quieter and colder. You can't divide what doesn't exist yet. What existed instead were forecasts. Expectations. The promise of future value tied heavily to momentum that could fluctuate. Betting guaranteed percentages on that future wasn't just generous, it was dangerous. And that's why ownership refused to budge. Not because they didn't believe in the league's growth, but because they understood how fragile early success can be. One bad season, one shift in attention, one economic downturn, and suddenly projections collapse. Revenue sharing locks obligations in place regardless of outcome. And in a league still finding its footing, that's a risk ownership wasn't willing to take. The problem for the union was that this explanation didn't land emotionally. It didn't satisfy the sense that players deserved more. And it didn't align with the visible signs of success fans were seeing. So the demand stayed. But the longer negotiations dragged on, the more that demand began to feel disconnected from immediate reality. Players weren't turning down revenue sharing because it was wrong. They were turning it down because it was delayed, abstract, uncertain. And once the salary numbers entered the conversation, that contrast became stark. Ownership was offering guaranteed money now. Revenue sharing promised potentially more later. That difference split opinions sharply. Stars could afford to gamble. They had income streams outside the league. They could wait for the system to mature. For them, revenue sharing was an investment. For others, it was a risk they couldn't afford. And ownership knew that framing revenue sharing as a future concept rather than a present entitlement weakened its appeal. Not through argument, but through patience. They didn't need to say no forever. They just needed to say not yet. And not yet can be devastating in a negotiation built on urgency. This is why the illusion cracked. Revenue sharing stopped being seen as a solution and started being seen as a stalling point. Something that could be revisited once the league was profitable, once stability was proven, once the system could sustain it. But that timeline didn't help players facing decisions now. Contracts had to be signed. Careers had to move forward. Opportunities didn't pause for ideals. And the longer ownership stayed calm, the more that reality set in. Publicly, the union continued to push the concept as non-negotiable. Privately, players were reassessing how much they were willing to sacrifice for a model that might not benefit them in time. That's when ownership strategy fully came into focus. They weren't rejecting the future. They were controlling the present. And in doing so, they forced the union to confront a harsh truth. The fight wasn't about fairness anymore. It was about timing. And timing, once again, favored the side that could afford to wait. But looming over this entire debate was a presence nobody could ignore. A surge in attention and value tied to one phenomenon that ownership understood better than anyone else. Because even as revenue sharing was debated, a single name was reshaping expectations, pressure, and perception across the entire league. And the way ownership handled that influence revealed just how committed they were to staying in control. There was a name hovering over every conversation. It didn't need to be said out loud. It didn't need to appear in official statements or negotiation summaries. But everyone in the room knew it was there, shaping expectations, influencing pressure, and quietly distorting the sense of urgency on both sides. That name was Caitlin Clark. Not as an individual demand. Not as a bargaining chip she personally wielded, but as a symbol of something much bigger, momentum, attention, a glimpse of what the league could become if everything broke right. Her presence changed the optics of the negotiation almost overnight. Ratings spiked. Arenas filled. Sponsors leaned in. Media coverage exploded. For the first time in a long time, the league felt like it was entering a different phase of relevance. And that's exactly why ownership refused to negotiate as if that future was guaranteed. From the outside, it looked counterintuitive. If momentum was finally here, why not lock in revenue sharing now? Why not reward players immediately while attention was at its peak? Because ownership understood something crucial. Hype is not stability. They'd seen it before. Surges of interest followed by plateaus. Short-term attention that didn't always convert into long-term financial security. And they weren't willing to build permanent financial obligations around a moment, no matter how electric it felt. This is where the Clark effect became complicated. She represented growth, yes, but she also represented uncertainty. A reminder that the league's current visibility was tied heavily to a small number of narratives, personalities, and moments that could shift quickly. Ownership wasn't denying her impact. They were refusing to mortgage the league's future on it. That distinction mattered. While fans and commentators framed the negotiations as the league failing to capitalize on momentum, ownership was deliberately slowing the conversation down. They weren't ignoring the surge, they were stress testing it. Can this level of attention be sustained? Will the numbers hold when novelty fades? What happens when the spotlight shifts? Those questions don't make for inspiring headlines, but they determine whether a league survives or collapses under its own promises. The union, understandably, wanted to strike while the iron was hot. The belief was simple. If the league is growing now, then now is the moment to demand structural change. But ownership saw it differently. They saw Clark's rise not as a deadline, but as a preview, a glimpse of potential that still needed proof. And that's why they were comfortable moving forward without changing the underlying financial model just yet. Because if the league could function, grow, and expand under the current system, then the pressure to concede vanished. Expansion plans continued. Free agency moved ahead. Operations stayed on track. The message was subtle but unmistakable. The league isn't dependent on one star. It isn't hostage to one moment. And it won't negotiate from a place of panic. That stance unsettled a lot of people. It challenged the idea that star power alone could dictate outcomes. It pushed back against the assumption that momentum automatically equals leverage. And it forced a recalibration of expectations across the board. For players, this was sobering. If the league was willing to keep moving forward, even during its most visible surge, then what exactly would force its hand? If this moment didn't create urgency, what would? That question didn't have a comfortable answer. Because the league had existed for decades before this surge. It had survived low visibility, financial losses, and limited attention. Growth was welcomed, but it wasn't required for survival. And ownership knew that. This is why the Clark effect became a shadow rather than a spotlight in negotiations. It raised expectations without guaranteeing outcomes. It created pressure that didn't translate cleanly into leverage. And it tempted players to believe that this moment was unique enough to force change, when ownership viewed it as one step in a much longer journey. That disconnect shaped everything that followed. Because once it became clear that ownership wouldn't negotiate off hype alone, the union lost one of its most powerful emotional arguments. Momentum didn't equal control. Visibility didn't equal authority. And popularity didn't override financial reality. The league had drawn a quiet line. It would grow at its own pace. It would expand on its own terms. And it would reward players when the foundation could support it. That stance didn't make ownership popular, but it made them steady. And in negotiations, steadiness is dangerous for the side relying on urgency. As the months pressed on, players began to feel that tension more acutely. The excitement surrounding the league didn't translate into immediate change. And the idea that this was a once-in-a-generation moment began to lose its power. Because moments fade, but contracts remain. And that realization forced players into a corner they didn't expect to find themselves in. One where waiting became more costly than acting. Which brings us to the point where everything turns personal. Because when negotiations stop being ideological, they become individual. And that's when the real unraveling begins. There's a moment in every negotiation when the language changes. Not publicly, not in official statements, but privately in phone calls, text messages, and late-night conversations that never make headlines. That moment arrived when waiting stopped feeling strategic and started feeling expensive. Because while negotiations dragged on, life didn't slow down. Seasons approached. Training plans had to be finalized. Housing decisions needed to be made. Families needed certainty. And for many players, the question stopped being about what the league should do and became about what they personally could afford to do. This is where the collective mindset begins to fracture. At first, patience feels principled. Everyone tells themselves the delay is temporary, that holding the line will pay off. But patience is a luxury, and like all luxuries, it isn't evenly distributed. For some players, waiting meant inconvenience. For others, it meant risk. Every day without clarity increased that risk. Free agency windows don't stay open forever. Teams don't hold spots indefinitely. Expansion drafts don't pause because negotiations feel unresolved. And once those processes begin moving, the consequences become very real, very fast. Players started asking different questions. What if the offer disappears? What if the team moves on? What if I wait too long and lose leverage entirely? Those questions aren't dramatic. They're practical. And practicality doesn't care about slogans. For veterans nearing the end of their prime, uncertainty is dangerous. A delayed decision can be the difference between one last meaningful contract and being forced into a fallback role. For younger players, momentum matters. Sitting idle while others position themselves can stall development and exposure. And then there's the simple reality of income. Not everyone has endorsements. Not everyone has savings built over long careers. Not everyone can gamble on future gains. So while leadership spoke about long-term value, individual players were doing short-term math, calculating how long they could wait before the risk outweighed the reward. That's when ownership's patience paid off. They didn't need to rush because they weren't the ones facing immediate consequences. Their costs were fixed. Their timelines were flexible. And as long as operations continued, the system worked in their favor. Players, on the other hand, felt every delay. Training regimens depend on clarity. Relocation decisions depend on contracts. Career planning depends on timing. And timing was slipping away. This is where the illusion of equal footing collapsed. Negotiations are often framed as two sides meeting in the middle. But in reality, power lies with the side that can absorb delay without damage. And once that imbalance became obvious, the emotional weight of the standoff shifted dramatically. Players didn't suddenly abandon their beliefs. They simply recognized that ideals don't pay bills. Waiting had a cost. And that cost was compounding. Agents felt it too. Their job is to protect clients, not causes. And as the weeks passed, more conversations turned toward contingency planning. What happens if this drags on? What if offers arrive under old terms? What if someone else signs first? Those conversations don't mean betrayal. They mean survival. And ownership understood that once individuals start thinking in those terms, collective leverage weakens naturally. Not through conflict, but through necessity. No one needed to break ranks publicly. They just needed to make decisions privately. That's the most effective kind of pressure because it doesn't create resistance, it creates acceptance. Players began to realize that the league wasn't going to blink, that operations would continue regardless of sentiment, and that holding out indefinitely wasn't a realistic option for most. So the question shifted again. Not who's right, but what happens if I wait? And the answers weren't encouraging. Because while negotiations stayed unresolved, opportunities didn't stop forming. Teams built relationships, identified priorities, mapped out depth charts. And once those plans solidify, latecomers rarely benefit. Waiting no longer felt like leverage. It felt like falling behind. That's when the idea of unity became fragile. Not because players stopped believing in the cause, but because the system punished hesitation. And systems don't negotiate. They just operate. This is the moment ownership was waiting for. Not a public collapse. Not a dramatic announcement. Just quiet realization. Because once enough players reach that point internally, the outcome becomes inevitable. And the next phase doesn't happen in press releases or interviews. It happens when the first few players decide they can't afford to wait anymore. And once that door opens, it never closes quietly. Because when individual decisions start shaping the market, collective power fades fast. And that's exactly where this situation was heading. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no breaking news alert, no viral clip, no dramatic statement signaling the end of resistance. Instead, it began the way these things always do, quietly, almost invisibly, in decisions that felt personal rather than political. A player signs. Another commits verbally. A conversation that was once hypothetical becomes real. And just like that, the tone changes. Because once the first domino falls, everything accelerates. What had been framed as a unified front suddenly becomes a collection of individual choices. Not because loyalty vanished, but because reality demanded action. Players who had waited as long as they could began to prioritize certainty over symbolism. And ownership was ready. They didn't need to celebrate. They didn't need to gloat. They simply allowed the system they controlled to do what it was designed to do, reward movement and penalize hesitation. Teams moved forward with their plans. Rosters began taking shape. Opportunities solidified. And as those pieces fell into place, the union's leverage eroded rapidly. This is the uncomfortable truth about labor standoffs in professional sports. Collective power is fragile when careers are short. It depends on perfect alignment, perfect timing, and perfect patience, conditions that almost never last. Once even a small number of players choose certainty, the dynamic shifts irreversibly. Because now, waiting isn't just risky. It's disadvantageous. Players still holding out begin to feel the squeeze. Not from ownership, but from the market itself. Teams fill needs. Cap space gets allocated. Priorities change. And suddenly, the offers that once seemed inevitable are no longer available. That's when fear replaces principle. Not panic, just quiet urgency. Players start asking whether they missed their window, whether holding out cost them leverage instead of gaining it, and whether waiting any longer will only make things worse. Ownership doesn't have to say a word. The math speaks for itself. This is why the union's position became untenable. They weren't defeated by force. They weren't undermined publicly. They were outlasted. And once that happens, even the strongest messaging can't reverse momentum, because momentum favors action. The players who move first don't just secure contracts, they set the market. They establish expectations. And everyone else has to respond to the reality they create. That's how leverage disappears. Not in one dramatic moment, but through accumulation. A few signings, a few commitments, a few players deciding they can't wait anymore. Each decision seems small on its own. Together, they end the standoff. This is where the union's internal contradictions fully surface. The idea of holding out for structural change collides with the reality of a market that no longer waits. And once that collision happens, compromise becomes inevitable. Not because ideals change, but because circumstances do. Ownership understood this from the beginning. They weren't betting on players giving up. They were betting on time. Time would separate theory from practice. Time would expose who could afford to wait. Time would turn unity into individual calculation. And time delivered. By the time it became clear what was happening, it was already too late to reverse. The framework of the season was set. Expansion plans were moving. Free agency was unfolding, not in headlines, but in quiet commitments that shaped the landscape. The union still existed. Negotiations still continued. But the balance had shifted permanently. From collective demand to individual decision. From urgency to inevitability. This is the moment most fans never see. The point where a labor standoff doesn't end with a bang, but with acceptance. Because once enough people move on, the fight is effectively over. And the league moves forward. But that doesn't mean the story ends here. Because the aftermath of this standoff carries lessons far beyond a single negotiation. Lessons about power, patience, and the harsh economics of professional sports. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about money. It was about who could afford to wait longer. And only one side ever truly could. Which brings us to the final realization, the one that reframes everything that came before it. When everything settles, when the noise fades and the headlines move on, this moment will be remembered very differently than it was sold. Not as a heroic standoff. Not as a dramatic battle between good and evil. But as a quiet demonstration of how power actually works in professional sports. Because this was never just about salaries. And it was never just about revenue sharing. It was about who could afford to wait. Ownership didn't win because they were louder. They didn't win because they were more popular. They won because they understood the system better and trusted it to do the work for them. They knew the league could survive uncertainty. They knew operations could continue. They knew time was on their side. And most importantly, they knew players had limits. Careers are short. Windows close fast. Opportunities don't wait for perfect conditions. And eventually, every negotiation stops being about principle and starts being about survival. That's not cynicism. That's reality. The players' union didn't fail because they were wrong. Many of their arguments made sense. They failed because they overestimated leverage and underestimated patience. They believed momentum would force change, when momentum alone doesn't pay contracts. Growth felt like power. Visibility felt like leverage. But neither translated into control. And that's the hardest lesson here. The league didn't panic during its most visible moment. It didn't bend because attention was high. It proved something uncomfortable instead, that it can move forward with or without consensus, with or without stars, and with or without public approval. That realization changes everything. It reshapes how future negotiations will be approached. It reframes what leverage actually looks like. And it sends a message that won't be forgotten anytime soon. Power doesn't belong to who deserves more. It belongs to who can wait longer. And in this standoff, only one side truly could. The machine kept running. Contracts moved. Plans solidified. And while the debate raged publicly, the outcome was already being decided quietly. That's the part most people missed. So the next time negotiations heat up, the next time deadlines come and go, remember this moment. Remember how calm masked control. Remember how silence beat noise. And remember that in professional sports, the side that controls time usually controls everything else. If you want more breakdowns like this, the stories behind the headlines, the power plays nobody explains, and the moves that shape the league long before fans notice, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story isn't the last one like it. Not even close.